It was pouring rain too, by the way, so we were soaking wet the whole time.
I do remember that.
Hello. So welcome to this conversation. I'm Brian L. Frye, the self-dubbed Dogecoin Professor of Law and Grifting at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guests are Casey Reas, a conceptual artist, professor of design and media arts at UCLA, and co-founder of the processing programming language and Feral Fire, and Jason Bailey, better known as Artnome, the CEO and co-founder of Club NFT and a prominent collector and theorist of NFT art. So welcome to both Jason and Casey. I thought I'd start off with a really kind of big picture, open-ended question, kind of reflecting on the NFT space as it is now and as it's developed over the course of the last several years. So Jason, Casey, why do you think people want to collect NFTs in the first place? And how do NFTs relate to the traditional art market, if at all?
It's a great one. Casey, you want me to start, or do you want to take this one?
I defer to you, man. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I mean, I would say inherently, we as humans are collectors in general, right? So we like to collect things more broadly. But for a lot of folks, I know for me, I kind of grew up in a lower middle class town, and art wasn't really the emphasis for a lot of the people I grew up with. And then later on, even when I went into tech, where maybe people had a little bit more discretionary income, for a lot of folks, art feels like this thing that's only for like the ultra wealthy or people that have a background in art. And it felt like maybe there were a lot of folks that were curious and always thought they liked art and were interested in meeting and talking with artists, but maybe just felt like it wasn't a thing for them, or they didn't know how to get into it. And I think that's particularly true with digital art. So even folks that were comfortable in the art world and grew up going to galleries and museums and things like that, digital art still had this sense as something that like wasn't tangible or ownable. I mean, sure, there was a relatively small number of collectors out there that would collect things on like thumb drives or DVDs or hard drives or things like that. But again, there's a fair amount of social and technological friction there, I think, that started to come down when NFTs became popular. The irony is that the onboarding process for NFTs is pretty ridiculous and complicated, right? Like for someone new to get in and start collecting NFTs, and you have to get this currency and you're paying gas fees where you're losing money just to transact, and you need to like learn a little bit of the lingo and figure out how to get in. But I think that speaks to just how pent up the demand was for a lot of people to want to collect art, that, you know, just removing a few of the barriers and making it so that you could do it from home, and like, you know, there's less worry about judgment, and you can just collect what you like. And, you know, I think it removed enough of the barriers that we saw sort of a tsunami of interest. The last thing I would say is part of that probably is also around speculation. So, you know, there's probably a good chunk of folks that wanted to collect art and never saw a clear path to it. There's another chunk of folks that read every day for the last year, this 12-year-old made $5 million in NFTs, you know, learn how or whatever, right? So you had some people FOMOing in. But I'm always careful not to classify or write off that group as somehow disingenuous. I actually think a lot of folks that came in sort of FOMOing in, that maybe didn't grow up with art as an option or as a thing that they thought they'd be interested in, came in initially to invest and have become sincere supporters of art and like made connections with artists. So yeah, I think there's a natural interest to collect, and there were enough technical and social barriers that folks didn't think it was for them. Ironically, NFTs have lowered those bars despite being fairly complicated. That'd probably be my answer.
Yeah, I think the same way that art is a really big space. You know, you have, it's the hugest possible space. It's happening in grade schools. There are people who are doing landscape photography. There are artists in their studios working with oils. It's a massive space. The NFT space is also equally massive and expansive. And there are artists releasing NFTs, serious artists who have decades of work. And then there's projects that are flippant, fun, goofy, absurd. It's a massive space. I think in the art world, there's decades of precedent leading up to this. There's like the dematerialization of the art object over decades. There is the web happening and early net art in the 1990s, where dematerial art moves into a networked environment. And then digital art has never found a way to really be collected. There's always been a lot of friction with forcing that kind of work into galleries, into institutions. And I think all those things really connected at once with the addition of blockchains to allow this to happen at this particular moment in time.
So what, if anything, the two of you think is distinctive about NFT art as a genre or a category of art? Is it different from other contemporary art styles? Is it a kind of a way of doing contemporary art? Does the kind of inclusion of the blockchain inflect or affect the nature of the artistic project that people are engaging in?
I think there's a lot of genres within the NFTs. And I think one reason I'm glad to be talking with Jason today is that I think there's a difference between crypto art and digital art. And Jason's been involved in crypto art since the early days. I wasn't engaged with NFTs when it was a crypto art scene because that just wasn't my world, my aesthetic environment. But when digital art started moving into NFTs, that's when I became very engaged.
Yeah, I would say that crypto art, because it's such a broad topic that there are a lot of different ways to define it, but I've been working lately to to update my initial definition, which came out in sort of early 2018 and was adopted by a lot of folks as the space grew. But generally for me, what crypto art versus NFTs, what crypto art is, it's an experiment on what happens when you let everyone participate, right? So for better or worse, wherever you land on sort of the traditional art world, there is sort of this ladder and you kind of work your way up the ladder and, get access to shows and eventually maybe to museums and things like that. And there's an expectation that you'll have some, type of background. And, from some of the analysis I've done, it can be pretty difficult if you're born in certain parts of the world that don't have access to, the better known museums or universities to participate. So there was this idea in early crypto art where they looked at what was happening with banking and they said, cryptocurrency after that, 2008, 2009 crash, people didn't trust centralized authorities and they thought, well, maybe we can have these trustless systems where we don't have to rely on middlemen like bankers and things like that. And we would have cryptocurrency as a way to get around that. Crypto art is sort of an extension of that, but rather than trying to get around the rules or participation of middlemen like bankers, they thought this could be sort of an alternative to the traditional art world where a lot of people felt like they didn't have an access point into it. So if you look at, for me, the high point, and it's a pretty short time period, the high point of crypto art is really Rare Pepe wallet and then Data NYC. And in both cases, they said, we want everyone in the world who wants to be able to participate. We're not going to, in the case of Rare Pepe Wallet, we're not going to take any fees whatsoever, any commission. So there's no commission structure. We're not going to judge your art. We actually don't think it's our role to tell you that your art's good or bad. We think that's fairly subjective. And it would go against this idea that, there's centralized authorities or middlemen, right? So we want to let everybody participate. And we're going to try not to censor that work either, because it's not about whether or not we like it. It sort of, skews towards free speech. With Data, similarly, they had they had slightly maybe different politics, but they had a giant, tens of thousands of artists all around the world drawing online, extending each other's conversation sort of visually. And they were thinking more about how can we, without sort of having perverse incentives that maybe skew what kind of work the artists make, how can we introduce something that might be kind of closer to like UBI, where, if one of the artists does really well, the sales would then come back into the entire community so that everybody can kind of grow and develop together. So for me, crypto art, and then shortly after that, so this is like 2017 and 16, shortly after that, we see people that look at these mechanics and they say, oh, there's probably a way to commercialize this, right? Not that there's anything wrong with commercializing things, but like instead of taking no, fee at the point of sale, maybe we take a fee and we can actually build a business out of this. And you see things like, Super Rare or Known Origin or OpenSea start to develop that are a little bit cleaner and easier to use because they're taking some fees in order to keep it going. But when they start doing that and they start picking and choosing who can become part of the platform, it really becomes more of an NFT platform and much less of a crypto art platform. So crypto art is in some ways become like an ideal. Where I see it today would be in the more in the Tezos community, right? So if you look at like Hic@Nunc and FX Hash, I think there's actually a desire to keep those things decentralized. I wouldn't necessarily argue that all platforms should be decentralized, but I'm very happy that that experiment is actually still continuing somewhere, because I think there's merit to it. So yeah, I think crypto art is simply what happens when you let everyone participate. It's sort of radical inclusivity.
To also, sorry, Brian, can I dig in a little bit? Just some more threads back in history. The artists involved in the Fluxus movement, the artists involved in the early net art movements, they were making their own work, distributing it, releasing it their own way outside of the institutions. They were building their own communities and bootstrapping that. And I think that's similar to the early crypto art communities as well. So there are a lot of precedents, threading maybe even all the way back to moving away from the salon system in Europe in the 19th century. It's an ongoing thing. But Jason, I was wondering if you could say, like, really briefly, a little bit about the relationship between pop art and early crypto art and the way they might be related through the use of imagery.
Yeah, I appreciate that you brought up some of the anti-art movements, right? Because I think even Dada or like Marcel Duchamp and some of that stuff too relates to early crypto art, where they're pretty clearly kind of almost poking fun a little bit at the traditional art world, right? And intentionally trying to experiment with rules that sort of go against it. How I would say it relates to pop art. So pop art, folks think about like the most obvious examples are like Andy Warhol and the soup cans, or this idea that people would take visual imagery that maybe wasn't perceived as possible as being high art, and as a little bit to sort of be again sort of anti-art, or to sort of push the existing establishment. They're saying, what happens, like a Roy Lichtenstein with comics, or Warhol with his soup cans, what happens when we take this everyday iconography and elevate it to a level where it could be high art? And why are these things off grounds in terms of being able to be evaluated potentially on an artistic level? So I look at that compared to, say, rare pepes. So for folks that don't know, Pepe is this green frog that was used by pretty much everyone as a meme, right? So you could use it as a vessel to communicate just about anything for a long time. It eventually got problematic because it became co-opted by the alt-right. But I think that memes are actually maybe the most important and significant art in some ways of our generation. People don't think of them as being important, but when you think about how information travels these days, like uniquely through memes, the idea that you could take this sort of ever-present and unique format of communication and look at it through an artistic lens, I think that would be, for me, how you might be able to compare it to pop art, right? Like, let's not put things off limits as low art that we can't evaluate if they're sort of core to how we communicate as a society. Let's like dig in deeper and see what's there.
Well, so in light of that long history that both of you have been acknowledging, why is it that the NFT market and crypto art took off when it did? Like, what changed? People have been trying to create a market for digital art for a long time. People have been trying to create a market for crypto art, maybe not for quite as long of a time, but for quite a while as well. What changed and why? And what was it about the way that the blockchain technology developed that made this possible and kind of facilitated the development of this market when it happened?
I think it was a little bit of the long work that had been happening within blockchains and within cryptocurrencies, and the pandemic and people being restrained and being inside. But I really, maybe cynically or realistically, think a lot of it was based on speculation. We're now wealthy in ETH. What will we spend our money on? Let's spend money on these JPEGs. And I think with the idea that it was also an investment. And I think I'm okay with that. I think money's always flowed into art in that way. And what my hope has always been is to convert some of these crypto speculators into like really passionate collectors and to have a really deep understanding of art. I think there's a lot of other reasons, but that's sort of like one way to cut through.
Yeah, I would say having been through the 2018 slump, which is almost feeling like Groundhog's Day this year, like things just feel so much like what happened. 2017, there was sort of the hype, and Ethereum and Bitcoin were going up, and crypto kitties, crypto punks, and the very earliest versions of crypto art and people using this on a broader scale started to happen. And then when the currency tanked or started to go down and lose a lot of value, people, for the most part, lost interest, except for nerds like me and folks that actually weren't really necessarily there speculatively initially anyway, right? And it's not until 2021 when the Beeple sale happens that this starts to catch a bunch of news. And that's when I think we see the numbers of participants start to go up, because it's like, oh, there's this big opportunity, whether it's an opportunity to make money or an opportunity to be socially relevant or just something new that people want to check out. You have to know about something before, it can become popular like this. It's a little bit unfortunate in that it was largely driven by sort of this whopping $70 million Beeple sale, but that's not really surprising. I was just talking to someone the other day about how the only time anyone ever talks to me about art news, because they're like, oh, Jason, he's the guy that's into art, is when something sells for a bunch of money. And it's just the way the news works. Like, forget digital art and NFTs, for a second. Just generally, it's the Salvatore Mundi or Hockney's pool painting or whatever, or the Banksy work shredding itself. There's only two things that make the news for art: giant sales and people accidentally destroying art. And it's unfortunate. So, but it's certainly not unique to NFTs or anything I would blame NFTs for.
So what do you think is happening right now? I mean, as you say, Jason, the NFT market has seen sort of a bust and boom cycle in sort of high speed, even more so than the regular art market. But I think a lot more people are paying attention right now and looking at the NFT market and considering what it means. And, as everyone knows, we're in kind of a little bit of a rough patch right now. What's happening? What does it mean? And what do you see in the future?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like the web bubble in that, people this time around, people were quick to, maybe they only ever heard about Bored Ape Yacht Club or something else. And for them, that's all that was happening. And they were like, oh, I'm glad to see this is going away, because I don't think, cartoons of monkeys should sell for $500,000. For any of us that have actually participated to any degree, that is an aspect of this, but it's not monolithic, right? So there are all different components of this. Some will carry forward and some won't after the crash. I can tell you, having been part of this for the last 4 years, many of us sort of welcome the reprieve, right, away from the hype. Like, on the one hand, it took a lot of hype and many news stories last year for most people to hear about this. On the other, being in an environment where art sells like before it's even finished and everyone's competing with each other and trying to get reserves and this, that, and the other, doesn't necessarily lend itself to like introspection and thoughtfulness and things that a lot of us actually want in our art, as consumers of art. So it had its spot, but I think you're right. Unlike 2018, we've got many more people that are interested. So I think what we'll see, and I don't know how this could be anything but a good thing, is folks that were in to try to make a quick buck and get out and do things as fast as possible to like check the boxes to have some kind of drop and make some money aren't going to be interested anymore, because those opportunities are going to go away. Folks that were like, hey, wow, there's this whole new world of collectors that are, maybe didn't see themselves as collectors before, and this whole new world of artists who thought maybe there was no path for them to be compensated for their art. I think they're going to stick around, and we're going to see builders and creatives and artists kind of work together at a slightly slower pace in a more meaningful way. And the people that stick with it, I think, will be rewarded for sticking around.
Yeah, I mean, from my own perspective, I've been working in the same way for over 20 years now. I'm an artist who works with software. I guess first and foremost, I'm an artist. I'm also an educator. And then I also founded a gallery about 2 years ago too. But I've been making this kind of work in relative obscurity for a very long time. And I've been doing the same thing. And all of a sudden there were people interested in collecting the work in a way that they hadn't been before. So I think artists like myself are just going to keep making the work that we want to make, that we're really passionate about in the same way. And maybe we'll catch another wave in the future.
I guess my question for both of you in relation to that is, I mean, what do you see about the aesthetics of NFT art and the NFT market going forward? To what extent and how do you think the developing importance of the kind of NFT market is going to, or could, I guess, inflect the way that the art market works in both a sort of mechanical way, but also in the way that, you know, people expect art to look in the future?
One thing that for me has been extraordinary in the last 2 years specifically is that the art form of generative art, artists working with code, has always been in the larger art world. It's always been a small island way out in the ocean. And I've really seen that come to the foreground in the last year, largely through, as Jason says, sales make headlines. And so art blocks made a lot of headlines, made a lot of volume through code-based generative art. And I saw two things. I saw a lot of artists who have been around for a long time sort of move back into the space with new energy. But I also saw a couple of generations of artists sort of coming into it for the very first time. When an art form is completely non-commercial, there aren't opportunities for those artists to do the work full time and support their studio through their work. It ends up being something that you do out of passion at night when the day job is over. And a lot of those artists were able to convert to full energy into the studio. And that's been a massive change. And I really hope that will continue now. I think there's a spotlight and awareness of this form of work that is different. I mean, sorry, just to ramble a moment, it builds completely on the histories of drawing and painting and cinema and video. It's just in that range. It's like an emerging visual technology, but it is different in what the medium can do. And to see that begin to get some traction, for example, where we're all beaming into the Tezos booth right now, and the Tezos booth being largely about this code-based generative art. It's just an extraordinary thing to see it happen.
Yeah, I would add, so I've been deeply passionate about generative art since the late 90s, largely, and more so in the early 2000s, largely because of Casey's work with Ben Frye in creating the processing platform. So as an art student who grew up in a family of engineers but couldn't figure out how to speak the family language of code, processing sort of gave me that entry point. And when I was in early on sort of the crypto art side of NFTs, a lot of the aesthetics were driven by folks that had made a lot of money, and not surprisingly, in crypto, right? And that group tended to be more on the techie side. So there was this aesthetic that skewed towards sort of 3D and sci-fi and vaporwave and things like that, which is fine. It's not that I like or don't like that. And I think when you don't necessarily have traditional art training, one heuristic that you use to try to measure how good or interesting an artwork is how complicated it looks. Like, could I have made that? Or, is there a lot of detail there? So I think we saw a lot of sort of sci-fi 3D work for a while. In the back of my mind, I was sort of praying every night that like somehow generative art would come in as sort of the logical fit to NFTs. So generative art being art that's largely made with computers, at least when I'm talking about it, and that it sort of pairs nicely with NFTs. I don't think it was really until Tezos kind of came along and Hic-et-Nunc and some of these other platforms that I saw folks like Casey. I mean, that's not really fair because Casey had been exploring blockchain for a while, but a large number of folks that I sort of associate with Casey and people that have been doing generative art for a while really came in via Hic-et-Nunc and some of these other platforms. And, I tell this story a lot, but it's because it really was mind-blowing. For 4 years, no one wanted to talk to me about NFTs, and they thought it was ridiculous that I was buying like images I could see for free. For 20 years, no one wanted to talk to me about generative art. They're like, I don't know, it's just a bunch of shapes or whatever, or it looks like wallpaper, like no love, right, for either. And then last summer, out of nowhere, that's all anyone wanted to talk about was like generative art and NFTs. And I'm like, wow, this is great. Like it's sort of like the perfect outcome, right? So I couldn't be happier to see so many, particularly, folks like Vera Molnar. There are a bunch of folks that are still around in their 90s, Herbert Franke, who are getting the recognition while they're still alive that they deserve so often in art history. The great masters of a genre don't ever get to live this, to see the appreciation of their work. So more than anything, I'm thrilled that there are so many generative pioneers that are really, getting to see the public come around to understanding just how important their work is.
So specifically in relation to the observations that both of you just made, I feel like for a lot of people, for the general public, the public face of NFTs is a relatively narrow range of PFP projects. And I wonder why you think that is and whether you think that's likely to change in the future as people become more aware of the range of work being produced and sold in the NFT market.
Do you have an answer for that one, Jason?
I mean, you know me, I'll talk no matter what. I actually think that people like to be titillated and outraged a little bit, right? So particularly things like Bored Ape Yacht Club have a gift for staying in the news cycle. I think like actor Seth Green recently had his stolen and then he rebought it back. Like right around the time that the people that like hate these things start to have schadenfreude and think like, oh, good, now it'll go away. Somehow it just makes more news stories, right? Which actually elevates them and keeps them in the news. So I think art, is I've spent a quarter of my life in art school having lovely, nuanced conversations about art, but those conversations take some effort and thought, right? And the media tends to operate more in sound bites. And it's hard to do nuance in sound bites. It's much easier to be like, oh, this Hollywood actor bought a Bored Ape PFP or whatever, or had it stolen. So I think news about those things travels just a lot faster, which keeps them in the news and it keeps people interested in them. I mean, a lot of people that I know that I respect that actually have more of a digital art background than I do, I think spent the better part of the last 2 years hating NFTs because they weren't able to get past the news on, the sort of PFP front. And once they started discovering things, again, more like the FX Hash or Hiketnunk or Feral File or, some of those platforms, they're like, oh, there's other stuff here, and that's not for me to be a snob, by the way. I think it's great if people love crypto punks and Bored Apes and things like that. There's a debate about what's art and what's collectibles, but I think ultimately it's fairly subjective. And if you're sincerely excited about those things, like all the more power to you. I just think it's unfortunate that they get so much of the press that it ends up being the only thing that people see.
I really wonder if we can consciously shift the dialogue around NFTs, or it's just like it's already happened in a way that it can't be shifted. But I think my own view of NFTs is that they're more about the provenance of the artwork. Like Jason Bailey had this work, and then it was collected by Casey Reas, and then Brian Frye had it. The blockchain, ideal for that, for digital things. And then also certificates of authenticity at the same time. And I know, Brian, you've written about this, but I think of NFTs as both provenance in the blockchains and certificates of authenticity. And in that way, anything can be an NFT. So for example, Rafik Anadol showing a really large projection on the beach in Miami is an NFT because it is associated with this provenance on the blockchain. Brian, what are your ideas about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with you in the sense that I think that, what people are doing is trading in an investment in the kind of future meaning of whatever project they think is going to be interesting to people later. But I guess my question for the two of you really is, to the extent we think that that's what's happening in the NFT market, and we see this market and technology developing and changing so rapidly, what, in your experience, makes a blockchain or a platform really work well for the NFT market as you see it having developed in the past, or as you see it kind of developing more into the future? Like, what do you think the future of the NFT market as a kind of technological experience and platform is going to look like?
So I'll throw something sort of outrageous out there, since it's sort of my current statement that I'm sort of pushing, which is that from what I can tell, something like 90% of NFTs are actually going to break in the next 5 years or so. So just a real quick explanation: NFTs, non-fungible token, the token itself lives on the blockchain, but it usually points out to images. So we've been looking at this study by yournfts.org where someone actually downloaded the bulk of Ethereum NFTs end of last year. And it's something like 10% of NFTs are fully online. About 40% are on private servers, on marketplace servers, right? We know marketplaces are all pretty much startups, and we know that 90% of startups fail, 50% of them in the first 5 years. When those marketplaces fail, you now have a permanent link from an NFT going to essentially nothing, right, on the private servers. The other remaining 50% use something called IPFS. And as long as folks back up their NFTs, you can actually restore the content, and then that link will go back pointing to the actual image. So whether or not those numbers are exactly perfect, we'll be sharing the results of the study. I think it's shocking to me that very few people are talking about the fragility of the construction of NFTs and dependence on marketplaces and centralization, considering how much money has gone into the space. And I think maybe part of the down market will be folks moving from sort of the drunken FOMO year of 2021 of like, let's just buy everything, everything's going up, to like, what did we really buy and how do we take care of these things? There's over 250 million NFTs out there now, right? So the idea that we're sort of manually going to go in and plop a Band-Aid on each of them may not really work, right? We kind of have to think about these things at scale now.
I really want to get through this idea of, am I collecting an NFT or am I collecting digital art? Am I collecting an NFT or am I collecting art? I think institutions have been very slow to touch these things. Like, I'm in conversation with a lot of global art institutions around NFTs. They all have working groups interior. They're all talking about it. But in terms of like bringing it into the collection, it's been very, very slow, when institutions work on time periods of decades rather than days like we do. But I think there's a number of technical things around NFTs right now that are really too limiting for artists. And I think one is definitely like file size limitations. I don't know, we can talk about platforms, we can talk about markets, we can talk about galleries, but restricting an artist to having for example, like a 50 megabyte file, which is very, very tiny for a video media, I think it's just too much limitation. And so like decoupling those file limitations and compression limitations from what can be collected as an NFT, I think is really important. Being able to add collector packages, with information about conservation along with the NFTs, how the NFT should be displayed, like the artist's intent around those things. And I think a lot of the rights right now are way, way too murky. And that's something that really is at the core of the Feral File project, is clearly laying out, as a collector, these are the rights the artist has granted you. And as an artist, these are your existing rights in perpetuity for this media. So I think if we can clarify those things, that will really help the future of seeing these things as more than, allowing collectors to become even more serious about this.
So I wonder how both of you think that NFTs fit into the larger art ecosystem. On some level, I feel like it's pretty easy to see how NFTs sort of integrate with the art market as a financial market, but the art ecosystem is a lot bigger than that. I mean, among other things, it includes institutions like museums and archives and so on. How should those institutions think about NFTs, if at all? And what does it mean to think about preservation and meaning in a kind of long-term historical context when it comes to art that's produced and sold in an NFT format?
So, I mean, I'm happy to start on that one. I think institutions should try to figure out if the work stands on its own, regardless of the medium, right? If you're collecting paintings on canvas, you're not collecting them on canvas because they're on canvas. You're collecting them because they're great paintings that fit into your sort of thesis of your collection, right? And you think they're valuable and have historical significance. So I don't think the fact that something is an NFT should neither play in its favor or against its favor as a work of art. I think sort of the novelty and the newness of this and the arguably excessive attention or hype that's kind of come along with it probably hasn't helped in making those decisions, because it's become sort of polarizing. But I would think that institutions would try to look at them sort of on their own merit. So that's sort of about the quality of the art. The second part about sort of preservation, I think, hope, believe, and am personally participating in trying to spend more time on the infrastructure side. I think what we saw last year was it was so obvious how quickly you could make money by buying and selling NFTs that's what everyone did when they were trying to figure out how to innovate. But I think we're starting to realize that we maybe grew too quick and there's some infrastructure stuff that has to get in place. A lot of it that Casey talked about, that Feral File focuses on, that sort of gives the additional information about the artist's intentions and what it is you own and things like that we need to do to catch up. And sort of our focus on the helping folks sort of back up their files. So there are questions around sort of the longevity of NFTs based on how they're constructed, but I hope that those are sort of independent of the questions about whether the art itself has the merit to actually belong in an institution.
From my point of view, as someone who works in digital media, I have maybe like 10,000 files of my work on my computer. Which thing is a sketch, which thing was almost finished, but I never finished, which thing is sort of like the work, that I would move into a gallery. And I think NFTs really help me to make those decisions clear. When it gets registered on a chain, that's my signal, for myself and for the world that this is like a finished work. These files and the hash of these files are that artwork. And so I think that helps working artists. It also helps collectors and institutions to get insight into how that artist thinks about these different artworks. It's just so fluid and flexible. I think it's a way of bringing clarity to a digital studio.
What do the two of you think that NFT collectors are currently looking for in the NFT market, and why? In other words, when people get interested and as more people become more and more interested, there's more meaning being generated as more and more people come to care about and be invested in this new kind and concept of ownership. What kind of ownership do you think people want, and what kind of ownership do you think people are going to want in the future?
At the moment, I'm really interested in art that is utilizes the blockchain and information around the blockchain. So one example would be Harm Vandendorpel's, sorry, are they called Mutant Cedar Garden? Can one of you help me? Do you know?
That sounds right. Yeah, I'm not
something around that.
But I've heard of
where the idea is that like periodically there's a chance that the work will mutate, that the work will change. And having a work that mutates over time, I think is really exciting. Like Matt Kane's Gazers, which is tied to lunar cycles, so that as as the moon changes in relationship to the Earth, the artwork changes every day. Things that can only exist in software or things that really work with the blockchain itself as a medium. I think there's too few examples of that, and I'm hoping a lot more will emerge over time.
Yeah, I think I'd piggyback on that. That personally, as a collector, I would like to see. We see a lot of still images on these, NFTs on our computers, which could be powered by software to do a heck of a lot more. My master's program from 2007 to 2010, we were doing all kinds of things with sensors and interactivity and software art, and I think we've yet to see that come, as heavily as I would have expected into NFTs. I mean, there's some projects like the ones that Casey referenced, but it'd be great to see more. The other part that I personally get excited about is people that maybe don't have any technical skill whatsoever and would never know how to use the blockchain, but have found this format, to express themselves where there's no other way that I would have seen their work, right? So seeing work from, populations and people in countries and areas that, I just didn't have access to before. So I think sometimes there's a notion that, that if an artist isn't using the blockchain as a medium, and I've heard people say like, oh, they're just hanging JPEGs on the blockchain or whatever, or that it's just for sales, that somehow is a negative. I can only speak for me, but for me personally, I think that's fantastic. I think it's great that there's this new outlet for people that are all over the world that maybe didn't have the privilege of growing up studying art history or getting to take art classes, and they're finding an audience for their work, right? And I'm hoping we see more and more of that too, right? So that's what I hope to see. I guess in terms of what I think other people hope to see or what they're getting out of it, Brian, I think there's probably two camps, and it's not that simple. They bleed one into the other. But the happiest people over the last 4 or 5 years are the folks that are looking for community and finding it. You think about the FX hash community is really strong right now, right? And we all kind of talk to each other every day, not even just about the art stuff. We've all just kind of found our family, and like to communicate and talk and share a lot of values or whatever. So there's sort of folks looking for community. And then with the current market tanking the way it is, I think a lot of folks that weren't there for the art of the community are looking for liquidity, right? They're trying to figure out like, how do I get out of this thing that I got into, right? So I think the key is, I say it all the time, but I believe it, is like, buy art you love from artists that you want to see succeed for prices you can afford, with the assumption you'll never be able to resell it. And if you had followed that along, I don't think you can really get hurt here. Like, that's a great way to become part of a community, grow and learn about art, support people. And hopefully folks aren't hurting too much from the down market if they kind of follow that advice.
So sorry,
super quick. Sorry, Brian. The NFTs I'm really most excited to see are generative art, things that are code-based, but the ones specifically that grow out of the histories of kinetic sculpture, avant-garde film, and experimental video, things that move, things that change with time, rather than just a piece of code that sort of creates an image that's static. And I think there's still too little of that. And I'm very excited to see that grow.
So in closing, I've noticed over the course of the last year and a half or 2 years, a sort of diverging conversation around what NFTs are supposed to mean in relation to artists and collectors. On one side, I think there's a tendency to think of them as representing a kind of ownership and control. And on another side, there's a sense in which they sort of people believe that they seem to kind of facilitate a sort of lack of need, or kind of a way of transcending the need for ownership and control. And I wonder what the two of you think about that dynamic, and where you think the kind of meaning of NFTs is, like the social meaning of NFTs is likely to go in the future.
That inherent friction is the thing that really got me extremely excited about NFTs at the beginning. This seemingly contradiction that something is accessible all the time to anybody with a network connection. The files are completely available. They can be downloaded. The fact that ownership or collecting is not tied to access, but the rights gained by collecting are, recorded in the blockchain, but the work itself is completely open. So this idea that a museum can be open every single day of the year at every moment, and the artwork can be seen in the way that it's intended to be seen through a browser window. That getting through that friction, or that what seems to be a contradiction, I think, is the first step to really embracing this new medium.
Yeah, I'm thrilled that people have come around to wanting art to be something that everybody can see, right? So they laughed at us when we first started this like 3 or 4 years ago and kind of popularizing it, saying like, you're buying something everyone can see for free. And we were like, isn't it great? Any dynamic that works against that is sort of counterproductive in my opinion, and I'm not fully divorced from it. I sort of spent 4 or 5 years trying to build this massive database of complete works by 20th century artists, right? By scanning all these catalog raisonnés and sort of how I got my start with Artnome. And one of the things that I realized in that process is that the majority of work by the majority of artists that we think of or study in school, from the last 70 years or so, I forget the exact cutoff date, are all under copyright. And we have this amazing tool in the internet where anyone anywhere could see all this amazing art by these people that we've sort of heralded over the decades and decades, but none of it's online because it's all under copyright, right? So I think this feels like a healthier, it gets lost sometimes, but this tweak towards everyone sees it, only one owns it is what we used to call it, in the beginning, feels like a healthier push towards the fact that other people see this actually makes it more relevant because more people can enjoy it and appreciate it. And not that it should always come back to financial things, but a lot of times these debates where people are like, why do you want to own it if everyone can see it? Well, that actually drives up the value too, right? So there's kind of a win-win-win all around. So any system that helps art get seen versus trying to make it more exclusive and hoard it or hide it, I think is a promising step.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much to both of you. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for having us, Brian. Yeah, great to talk to you, Casey.